Welcome back, Tyler.
Nice to be back.
So, I heard that if I bought coilovers and put them on my car, it'll make my car handle better.
Although that's usually the goal when you're buying new suspension, you can actually make your car handle worse.
What do you mean handle worse?
Well, there's a lot more when you're actually setting up a car or even a chassis in general for handling. The car has to work as a whole, not just one component. So as you're going through that process, there's a bunch of different things you want to keep in mind. And we kind of found another cheat sheet from another chassis manufacturer and some good guideposts or guide points when you're thinking about setting up your next build.
So, why don't we just so should we just run down the cheat sheet?
Yeah, I mean, it's always kind of like, where do you start, right? Well, the best place to start is, where do you want to end? What's the plan for this car? Is this going to be my next time attack monster? Is this my weekend cruiser? Or is this just my fun daily? Or is it somewhere in between?
And then, yeah, that's actually a really tough conversation you have to have for yourself, right? Because everyone wants the idealized like track monster, but depending on what you're really going to use the car for, that may not be practical, or you may have to decide like, hey, this is not going to be livable for me.
Absolutely. It's all about kind of making those internal compromises and being honest with yourself.
Yeah.
If you have to drive it every day and your commute involves horrible potholes and numerous speed bumps, setting up a car to be 10/10 for the track is probably not a good idea.
And that leads us to the second item on this sheet is ride height.
Absolutely. Hey, I'm also a fan of having a car that's completely tucking wheels and down slammed. But on my track car, that's not what my goal for ride height is. I want to have as much usable stroke and suspension as possible. So I put the car up at what's usually referred to as a functional ride height.
So I always thought lower was better for race cars.
So there's actually kind of a median. There's a point of no return as well, where you can take a car and start getting into what we were talking about earlier, making it worse. And the hard part about that is it actually ties into a couple of other topics we'll talk about later. But I mean, this is kind of definitely one of the cruxes of being a car guy, right? Like, if you're getting your car and you're personalizing your car, especially if you're looking at suspension, you're going to lower it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course.
So you kind of have to have that real honest conversation with yourself. It's like, how low does the car have to be? Because deciding how low the car has to be is going to impact a couple of other things you're going to have to look at. For my daily driver, I only lowered the car maybe an inch. This was from a sedan that had a pretty high ride height to begin with, so it wasn't a major impact on the rest of the systems. For my race car, oh yeah, I wanted to go lower.
So the next item on our list, tire grade, or what's a better term for tire grade?
This comes back down to tire compound.
Tire compound, yeah.
And this is going to be dictated probably by that first thing you decided, like, what am I going to use this car for?
Yeah.
If it's going to be in a racing class, well, you're probably restricted to a certain type of tire.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that's full carcass slicks, R compounds, or a limited treadwear rating, that plays a huge role in the rest of how you're going to set up your car. Again, and if it's your street car and you're running some 360 treadwear tires that are fun, but you're trying to get 30,000 miles out of them, that's going to impact a couple of other things as well.
Yeah, that also goes back to intended use, because while I would love to have, under 100 treadwear tires, when it rains outside, that's not safe. So,
yeah, I've had that experience on some year-old autocross tires with no tread left, and we called that the kind of come to Jesus moment when you hit that in the old R1Rs, and you get to see just how good that wet weather handling of yours is.
Awesome. So, the next item on our list, alignment.
Absolutely, and the reason we're kind of going down in this order is once you know what the car is aiming for. Once you know how low or the effective ride height you want the car to have, and you know the kind of tires you're going to be using, now you can start figuring out alignment specifications. I mean, keep in mind, things like an R compound tire don't need as an aggressive an alignment sometimes. Sometimes a certain type of 200 tread wear tire is going to have a narrow range of camber that it functions at. So this is somewhere you can get a lot of information from the actual tire manufacturers themselves, including even target pressures and all kinds of good starting info. It's never going to be the same as actually pulling data with a tire pyrometer or finding out just from other people in your group what's been working for them. But the real goal here is to find out and to go back to your decision about what the car is being used for. Am I going to run an aggressive alignment that's going to eat my tires up to make that compromise to get 2-3 more tenths of a second out of a lap? Or am I going to dial this back because I am going to put 10,000 miles on the car this year and I don't want to have to buy tires all the time?
Yeah, exactly. Making a compromise for realistically how you're going to use your vehicle, because for a lot of us, our cars serve double duty where this is my daily commuter, but I also do track days or autocross on the weekends.
And there's a really good way to get around at least a little bit of this specific part of this. 2 sets of wheels. Track tires, street tires. You can even keep an alignment setting that's a little bit more aggressive for those weekend race tires on your street wheels. And what actually can change it and make it not as aggressive is the offset or width of the wheel itself.
Okay.
So if you step down to a narrower wheel and tire package, your effective wheel rate reduces.
What is the wheel rate? I don't know what that is.
So, not to get too deep into too much suspension jargon, basically it's the effective roll stiffness at the wheel. Think about it this way. If you put on wider wheels and tires, the ride actually gets firmer because you're creating more leverage on the axle and artificially increasing that rate. So by going to a narrower wheel and tire, it almost softens the car.
Okay.
Which is another way to sort of soften the car if you're going to be using it for dual duty use. I'm the opposite. I actually run a more aggressive offset, wider wheel with a stretched tire because I think it looks better for my daily.
Don't do that, you guys. Don't listen to Tyler. Listen to Tyler for the rest of this podcast except what he just said.
There's no accounting for taste. What can I say?
So the next item on our list, spring rates. And I think spring rates is another one of those, like, there's a huge misconception on spring rates. Again, like lower is better, higher spring rates is better. Let's hear about that.
Well, part of it comes down to, this is really going to get back to a little bit more of the hard data, right? Your motion ratio and your spring rate are going to basically dictate that wheel rate, that actual frequency at which the car is operating at. And some people don't mind a high frequency. You can run a pretty stiff spring in a car and it might not be that bad, or it may only be bad over certain types of bumps in certain settings. When you're at the track, though, it's a different story. You need it to be at a certain minimum level to keep up with the amount of forces you're generating. So, fun fact, it all ties back together. Those forces you're generating are going to be impacted by your tires. Tires are going to be part of your overall threshold of grip. The alignment at which you put the tire also is going to dictate that threshold of grip. If you're on R compounds with an aggressive alignment, you're going to be generating 1.2, 1.5 Gs in a corner. You're going to have a pretty significant amount of spring to be able to keep the car at the similar ride height. Because remember, that's the point of the spring, is to try to keep the car at one height.
You brought up a really good point that just reminded me about choosing the spring rates per what tire you have. Similarly, in my experience, because I've been through how many aftermarket brake setups, is that on my old FRS, I had 6 pots and 6-pot fronts and like a really aggressive front pad. But the car didn't stop that well for how big the brakes were, and because I was limited to a certain tire compound in that class.
Yeah, that's another thing people can miss. And it's another similar integration in the systems is that braking force is highly dictated by your tire compound. But because of that, keep in mind, when your braking forces increase, so does your weight transfer. When your weight transfer increases, your spring rate needs to increase to help control that weight transfer. So sometimes even just going to a stickier tire isn't necessarily a problem over bumps or turns, but you can overload it by having a harder amount of braking force. A lot of tracks that have minor elevation change, this can play a role because when you're coming down a downhill straight and you lay into the brakes and suddenly you have a lot more force on the nose, depending on what you're driving, it can get pretty exciting.
Yeah, no, to say the least, like braking and then the rear end deciding to do what it wants.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fun if you planned for it.
No, not fun, man. Okay. Dampers, or in other words, shocks.
Yeah. So again, we've covered what the spring's job is. Well, now the damper has to kind of tie everything together and keep that spring under check. So this is almost like that checklist. Once you've figured those things out, once you know the effective spring rates you're going to be running based on the other factors, you can start dialing in a damping curve. And this is something that we spend a lot of time on at Annex, because once we've calculated what the chassis is going to be producing in whatever form it's going to be run at, then we can try and match the curve of the damper to meet those forces. So the easiest way to think about this is when it's your daily, you know what? I probably don't need adjustable suspension. Not on most cars. People used to use a lot of things like Takikos or Aluminas or other simple like sport shocks. Usually has a little bit more compression in the low end, so it gives a little bit better feedback, and it generates more force than a stock shock. Usually a great pairing with lowering springs. The next step up from that is something like an adjustable Coney or a Bilstein damper. Great stuff. And they are what they usually are sold at as a sport shock, right? This is when you're starting to do more track days, maybe your autocross, maybe something that's a little bit more consistently seeing a motorsports use. So coilovers can kind of be the next step up from that. But coilovers run a wide range. You have everything from hardcore full carcass race slick forces down to I still want height adjustability, but it's still a street car. So that's one of the reasons you really want to do your research when you're picking out a coilover. Does it meet that first step? Is this coilover designed to fulfill the purpose I want to use the car for? Is it a track coilover? Is it a daily coilover? Is it a dual duty coilover?
Yeah, that also ties into what will be, by the time this podcast released, it'll be last week's video. So make sure to check out the YouTube channel for that video with the WRX wagon about not settling for a generic setup, right?
Yeah.
Like we ask what the customer spring rates are so we can valve the shocks to that spring rate or to the length of spring, right? It's not just like choosing a spring rate and throwing it on the exact same shock that everybody gets.
Exactly. And there's a lot of times too where we see, or even I used to reach out to companies and be like, hey, I want to run this spring. Can your shock handle it? It shouldn't be right at the threshold of what forces the shock can handle, because then all your little clicks of adjustment go out the window.
Yeah.
Only maybe 2 or 3 of them are actually useful. It's always better to have something that's right in that window so you can use most of the shock, especially when it's an adjustable one.
Awesome. Yeah. So the last item on this list, clearances.
Yeah, more so than anything, this is just kind of getting into another series of tuning your suspension. This is something that we've had to spend a lot of time on at Annex in bump stops, clearance for...
Oh, hold on. We can take a pause.
Beep.
My bad. Get out of here, Jeff Wilson.
We technically skipped one too. We skipped geometry. So we could...
Oh.
We can leave it out, or we could circle it back.
You know what?
It's
Let's
up
do...
to you.
Sorry. We skipped it. Let's do geometry.
Because I wanted to actually bring that up in... It's funny that it comes so far after alignment, because I would almost start considering geometry right after ride height.
Okay. Yeah, let's do geometry. We'll do clearances last.
Cool.
But yeah, let's do geometry right now.
So, remember we were talking about making your car worse? This is all about that suspension and steering geometry. There are a number of chassis that are popular. Everything from old straight axle cars like 8.6 Corollas, up to just about everything that has a strut, that if you lower the car too far, you change the geometry and induce a bunch of bad habits, from bump steer to poor thrust angle to just awkward behavior.
Yeah, I mean, to the point where suspension components can bind up and the suspension doesn't work anymore.
Yep, absolutely. To the point where you've made it so that everything you've spent all your hard-earned money on is no longer functioning.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So there's all kinds of different things. They're usually very chassis specific, but it comes back to things that you want to keep in mind. You want to be able to make sure your suspension has motion. The old joke in autocross was any suspension will work as long as you don't let it. If you want to get a car loose, make the suspension lock up, because then that end of the car is going to lose all grip. Well, as much as loose can be fast, it's not always the best. Mm-hmm. To get grip, you have to have motion. So, getting it to the point where the motion's not bad. You're not bottoming out your travel because your lower control arms are inverted because you're too far low. Mm-hmm. Get those roll center adjusters to get back to an even playing field. If your axle, because you lowered it, moved to one side of the car or the other, whether it's a panhard bar or adjustable end links, adjustable forelinks, find something that can get you back at least to factory recommendations.
Yeah.
No one stays at factory recommendations. You're going to add more, but getting the right kind of caster available, getting the right kind of overall chassis alignment makes a huge difference on things like tire life, let alone the overall handling balance.
Yeah, definitely. So clearance is the last item on our list.
Yeah, this is something we've really had to spend some time on at Annex, because one of the things we pride on doing is increasing stroke length, droop length, and overall travel in a vehicle,
while maintaining clearance.
Yes, because just because you made it go further, it's got to be able to return.
Yep.
And a key part of when suspension tuning that often gets overlooked is the bump stop. The bump stop's not a boogeyman. It's not a bad thing. I know we're all used to cutting them on our shocks when we put our lowering springs on back in the day to get more travel, but a bump stop can actually be used as part of the tuning of the suspension. You need to know when that bump stop engages in the overall travel of the suspension, because you want it to engage before your shock runs out of travel.
Or before the wheel hits the fender.
Yes, that's the next step, because you need the tire to actually clear as well. Some cars are actually heavily limited by tire clearance, and it's not just, okay, I'm going to roll my fenders to get this clear. It may actually be the upper fender well that limits the upward travel. A good example of this is the GT86 chassis. In the fronts, they have a limitation of upward travel that can only be worked around so much. Again, it goes back to that first point. Have that end vision in goal. If it's a specific competition you want to participate in, if you want to get 2-3 more track days next year, have that end goal in sight, because when you pick your coilovers, they're a supported part of an overall system. There's those other items you have to take a look at: tires, height, alignment, geometry, and clearance.
Awesome. Thank you again so much for being on the podcast, Tyler. Another mind-blowingly chock full of information podcast episode.
Yeah, it's another good one, and it's all just falling out of my head, so hopefully it helps somebody else.
Awesome. So yeah, at the time of recording, we're actually going to Global Time Attack tomorrow morning.
Yeah, bright and early.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely stay posted on the YouTube channel and the podcast, and then look for the media coverage we get from there. Awesome. Thanks again, Tyler.
Thanks again for having me.